Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back, way back. Imagine the soft glow of lanterns, the smell of dusty parchment, and a long stretch of stone winding endlessly over mountains and deserts. That's right, we're heading to China. Not the neon skylines and bullet trains China, but the older one. The one with emperors who loved walls almost as much as they loved paranoia. So dim the lights, sink into your pillow, pretend you're a Ming Dynasty bureaucrat who just failed the civil service exam for the third time. And let's talk about the Great Wall. Now, the Great Wall is one of those things that everyone thinks they know. It's long, it's old. You can totally see it from space, except, spoiler, you actually can't. Astronauts have said it's basically invisible unless you're Superman with a zoom lens. But it's still impressive. We're talking over 13,000 miles of stone, brick, tamped earth, and broken dreams. The kind of project that would make even modern contractors say, yeah, we're going to need a few more centuries on this one. But the real question tonight isn't just what the wall is, it's why. Why did so many emperors, dynasties, and unfortunate peasants dedicate their lives, backs, and probably their spines to stacking rocks across mountains? Was it really to keep out the Mongols? Or was it one giant flex? Let's take it slow, because the wall itself is not just one wall. It's a patchwork quilt of walls, trenches, watchtowers, and fortifications built over, well, nearly 2,000 years. And like most family projects, each dynasty had its own opinion. The Qin wanted to show off. The Han wanted to guard their Silk Road trade. The Ming wanted to stop steppe raiders from stealing their lunch money. And in the end, a wall tells you more about the people building it than the people they were supposedly keeping out. The origins: warlords, bricks, and too much free labor. So let's roll back to before there even was a Great Wall. We're in the 7th century BCE. China isn't united yet. It's basically a bunch of squabbling states, all suspicious of each other. Think of it like medieval Europe, but with more rice fields and fewer castles. Every small kingdom wanted to protect itself, and their favorite trick was, surprise, walls. Local rulers started piling up earth and stone to block raids. Nothing fancy, just dirt walls and wooden palisades. The kind of thing you'd call temporary fencing today. But temporary in ancient China could still mean lasting centuries. Fast forward a bit, and along comes the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BCE. You know these guys, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the one who loved centralizing power, standardizing writing, and burying entire armies of terracotta warriors. Subtlety was not his strong suit. Naturally, when he unified China in 221 BCE, he looked at all those scattered little walls and said, yeah, let's connect them, but bigger. Because what's the point of being the first emperor if you don't have an insane public works project to prove it? So he forced hundreds of thousands of laborers, farmers, soldiers, and probably every unlucky soul within reach to start linking up the regional fortifications into one mega wall. Not made of stone yet, mostly packed earth. Imagine endless dirt ramps snaking across mountains. Romantic, right? Except for the workers, who basically got a one-way ticket to exhaustion. There's a reason some legends call it the longest cemetery on Earth. Was it effective? Sort of. It slowed down nomadic raiders from the north, the Xiongnu, for example. But mostly it screamed, hi, we're the Qin. We have power, we have labor, and we're not afraid to use it in the most back-breaking way possible. Of course, the Qin dynasty collapsed after about 15 years. Turns out terror and micromanagement are bad for long-term stability. But the wall idea? That stuck around. The Han dynasty, trade, silk, and guarding the candy jar. Enter the Han dynasty, starting in 206 BCE. These guys were much better at longevity, ruling for 4 centuries. They looked at the Qin wall and said, okay, nice effort, let's make it useful. For the Han, the wall wasn't just defense, it was economic. You see, during their reign, the Silk Road started buzzing. Silk, spices, horses, precious stones, it all flowed west. And nothing says, please don't raid my merchants, like a very large, very intimidating wall lined with garrisons. So they expanded, hundreds of miles more. Watchtowers, beacon fires, military colonies. Soldiers weren't just guarding, they were farming too, growing food so they could survive out there on the lonely frontier. The Han basically turned the wall into a chain of little frontier towns with soldiers who probably dreamed of being anywhere else. And here's the kicker. The wall also worked in reverse. It kept Chinese merchants and farmers from casually wandering off into nomadic territory, because the government liked to control trade and migration. Nothing says no unauthorized vacations like a 20-foot earthen barrier. Let's talk nomads, the real reason for all this paranoia. Now, who exactly were these terrifying outsiders the Chinese elites were so worried about? Mainly, nomadic horsemen of the steppe. First the Xiongnu, later the Mongols, and others in between. Nomads had a habit of sweeping down from the grasslands, raiding farms, and then disappearing back into the steppe faster than you could say, "Where'd my livestock go?" They weren't always enemies, by the way. Sometimes they were trading partners. Sometimes they were hired as mercenaries. And sometimes they were marrying into Chinese dynasties. But from the point of view of emperors sitting in their palaces, nomads were unpredictable. And nothing makes emperors more nervous than unpredictability. So instead of dealing with them in person, they built walls. Because it's much easier to pile up dirt than it is to negotiate year after year with horse lords who refuse to sit still. The medieval decline when walls weren't cool. Skip ahead a few centuries. Dynasties rise, dynasties fall. The Tang dynasty, they didn't really care about walls. They were too busy being the cosmopolitan, cool kids of medieval China, running trade routes, writing poetry, and inventing gunpowder. Who needs walls when you have booming cities and international clout? But eventually, the Mongols showed up. You might have heard of them. Genghis Khan, horses, arrows, that whole world-conquering thing. And honestly, walls didn't help much. The Mongols just went around them, bribed their way through gates, or conquered from within. When you're up against the largest land empire in history, a pile of dirt doesn't exactly stop the cavalry. So for a while, the Great Wall wasn't so great. Parts of it crumbled, others were abandoned. You can almost picture lonely watchtowers out in the desert with tumbleweeds rolling by, while the guards just gave up and went home. The Ming Dynasty, the glow-up era of the wall. Now we arrive at the Ming Dynasty, starting in 1368. These were the ultimate wall enthusiasts. If Qin Shi Huang laid the foundation, and the Han expanded it, the Ming Dynasty made the wall look like the glossy version you see in travel brochures today. Why? Because the Mongols weren't gone. Even though the Ming had pushed them out of Beijing and back into the steppe, the northern frontier was still a headache. Raids kept happening, and the Ming emperors, in their infinite wisdom, decided, let's not just repair the wall, let's rebuild it. In stone, with bricks, with towers, with every ounce of manpower we can squeeze out of the countryside. And that's when the wall became that iconic zigzag of stones stretching across ridges, steep staircases, watchtowers every few hundred meters, beacon towers for smoke signals. It wasn't just defense, it was communication. Light a fire in one tower and the signal could travel hundreds of miles in hours. The Ming Wall also symbolized the dynasty's obsession with control. These were the emperors who reigned from the Forbidden City, micromanaging officials with layers of bureaucracy. Of course, they loved the idea of a massive wall that screamed, "This is us, that is you. Stay out." But here's the ironic part. The wall wasn't foolproof. Mongols still raided. Later, the Manchus just marched through gaps and loopholes, eventually toppling the Ming altogether. The wall slowed enemies down, sure, but it never truly stopped them. So why was it really built? If we zoom out, the wall wasn't just about defense. It was propaganda. It was control. It was a way for emperors to say, we are civilized. They are barbarians. Look at our giant stone divider. It was also a job creation scheme, though not in the happy modern sense. Millions of peasants, prisoners, and soldiers were conscripted to build it. Many didn't come back. The wall consumed lives as much as it protected them. And yet, it worked, at least symbolically, because here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about it. Not the wars, not the treaties, not the raids, but the wall. So as you drift off tonight, imagine those endless stretches of stone winding over ridges and valleys. Not just a barrier, but a story. A story of fear, ambition, power, and maybe just a little too much free time on the hands of ancient emperors. Welcome back. Hopefully, you're still awake enough to hear this. Or maybe not. That's fine too. The Great Wall is a perfect lullaby subject. Repetitive, long, and slightly depressing. But let's keep going, because the Ming Dynasty wasn't even close to being finished with their wall-building mania. Ming Dynasty bureaucracy meets stonework. So the Ming had a problem. They hated the Mongols. Not just a casual dislike, but the kind of generational loathing that gets written into the family diary. And after the embarrassing trauma of the Mongols running the Yuan dynasty before them, the Ming were extra sensitive. They had nightmares about horsemen storming Beijing every time someone mentioned the northern frontier. The solution? Build, and keep building. By the 15th century, the Ming Wall stretched over thousands of miles. This wasn't just patchy dirt anymore. It was stone foundations, brick towers, crenellations, and proper gates with names, like the Gate of Right Righteousness, because apparently, poetic naming makes it harder for invaders to smash through. Every section of the wall had its own military district. Generals were stationed at strategic passes. Soldiers drilled, farmed, patrolled, and probably complained about the food. And the bureaucracy? Oh, it was suffocating. Reports upon reports, requests for bricks, memos about missing supplies. Imagine trying to keep track of thousands of watchtowers with paper scrolls and exhausted messengers. No wonder Ming officials always looked tired in their portraits. How the wall actually worked. Now, you might imagine the Great Wall as a medieval fortress, with Mongols charging and soldiers valiantly defending every inch. Not quite. The wall worked more like a series of speed bumps. Raiding parties could sometimes sneak through, bribe a gatekeeper, or just go around a less guarded section. But the wall slowed them down. It forced them into choke points where Chinese troops could concentrate. It gave time for smoke signals to spread warnings. Think of it as less of an impenetrable shield and more like a very expensive early warning system. Sort of like installing a billion-dollar alarm that still lets burglars in, but at least you know they're there. The cost of bricks and bones. Of course, none of this came cheap. Building with stone and brick required quarrying, transporting, and stacking in regions where even getting water was a struggle. So how did they do it? Easy, by not asking for volunteers. Peasants were conscripted. Criminals were sentenced to wall labor. Soldiers were rotated into construction duty. And conditions were, well, let's just say OSHA standards weren't really a thing in the 15th century. Many laborers died on the job from exhaustion, accidents, or just plain hunger. And no, contrary to popular myth, they weren't actually buried inside the wall like some kind of macabre filler material. But the death toll was still staggering, and families were often left without their main breadwinner. So, when tourists today marvel at the majesty of the Ming Wall, just remember, behind every scenic staircase was probably a farmer who really didn't want to be there. Myths and legends, and because every massive structure needs a few bedtime stories, the Great Wall collected its share of legends. One of the most famous is the tale of Meng Jiangnu. She was a dutiful wife whose husband was conscripted to build the wall. He died, naturally, because that's what happened to wall workers. When she traveled to find him, she wept so bitterly that a whole section of the wall collapsed, revealing his bones. It's not exactly a cheerful tale, but it became a classic. The story was retold in plays, operas, and poems for centuries. The moral? Walls may look strong, but human suffering will always seep through the cracks. Or maybe the moral was, don't anger your peasants too much. Hard to say. There's also the myth that the wall can be seen from space. That one's more modern. It turns out you can't. Astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Yang Liwei all confirmed it. From orbit, the wall is too narrow and blends into the landscape. Highways and airports, much easier to spot. The wall, not so much. But myths tend to stick because they sound cooler than reality. Beyond defense, walls as symbols. By this point, you may be wondering, if the wall didn't completely stop the Mongols and cost a ridiculous amount of resources, why keep it up? Because walls aren't just military, they're psychological. They send a message. To the nomads, this is the edge of our world. To the peasants, your emperor is watching, even from 500 miles away. And to the emperors themselves, look at us, so civilized, so organized, unlike those wild horsemen. The wall reinforced a worldview, civilization on one side, chaos on the other, which of course was a simplification, since trade, diplomacy, and intermarriage blurred the lines all the time. But emperors loved clear boundaries. They made administration easier, even if reality didn't agree. The fall of the Ming, when the wall didn't save them. And here's where things get a little ironic. Despite all the stonework, the Ming dynasty still collapsed. By the 17th century, corruption, famine, and rebellions had weakened them. And while they were busy patching cracks in their political system, the Manchus from the northeast were gaining power. In 1644, the Ming were toppled. And how did the Manchus get past the supposedly impregnable wall? Easy. They were let through. A Ming general named Wu Songui opened the gates to the Manchu army, partly to fight off a rebel faction, partly because switching sides seemed convenient. So much for an unbreakable barrier. The wall couldn't protect against betrayal, bad politics, or human ambition. The Qing dynasty, a shrug at the wall. Once the Manchus established the Qing dynasty, they didn't really care much about the Great Wall. Why? Because they were the outsiders from beyond the wall. They didn't need to defend against themselves. Instead, they expanded China's borders far beyond the wall, into Mongolia, Tibet, and Central Asia. For them, the wall was more of a monument than a necessity. They maintained parts of it, sure, but it wasn't central to their strategy. Trade, alliances, and brutal military campaigns mattered more than endless brick repairs. So, in many ways, the Great Wall reached its peak in the Ming dynasty and then quietly retired into semi-redundancy, the long nap of the wall. After the Qing and into modern times, the Great Wall fell into disrepair. Some parts crumbled into rubble. Villagers stole bricks to build their homes. Sections got buried under sand dunes. And for a while, nobody really cared. It wasn't until the 20th century that the Chinese government started to reclaim the wall as a cultural symbol. In the 1950s and later, parts were restored for tourism. And suddenly, the wall wasn't a neglected ruin anymore. It was a national icon. Today, millions of tourists march up its steep steps every year. Couples take wedding photos on it. Vendors sell bottled water and T-shirts nearby. It's less a frontier defense system, more a giant open-air museum with surprisingly overpriced snacks. The irony of legacy. So here's the ultimate irony. The Great Wall, built at enormous human cost, never really achieved its original purpose. It didn't permanently stop invasions. It didn't guarantee dynastic survival. And it was often ignored by the very rulers who built it. But as a cultural symbol, it's unbeatable. It's on postcards, coins, stamps, and the background of every Welcome to China video. It became more powerful as a memory than it ever was as a military structure. In other words, the wall failed at war, but won at branding. Drifting Thoughts to End, Part 2. As you're lying there now, maybe drifting towards sleep, picture the wall again. Not the tourist trap version with fresh bricks, but the lonely, crumbling stretches in the Gobi Desert. A watchtower half buried in sand. Stones falling away into valleys. Silent, forgotten. And then remember, every stone placed there was carried by someone. Someone who might have rather been home planting millet, or drinking tea, or not dying of exhaustion. The wall is a monument not just to emperors, but to millions of invisible workers whose names we'll never know. And that's the strange comfort of history. The emperors wanted glory, but what survived was the labor of ordinary hands. Endless, ordinary hands, stacking stone upon stone. So we've watched the wall rise under the Qin, expand under the Han, glow up under the Ming, and then basically get ghosted by the Qing. But here's the thing. The Great Wall is less about bricks and more about stories. Tonight, let's float through those myths, the real way defenses worked, and the long afterlife of this oversized stone ribbon. What the wall could and couldn't do. First, let's talk logistics. Because we need to clear up this weird idea that the Great Wall was some kind of magical force field. Spoiler, it wasn't. What it could do: slow down small raiding parties, force horsemen into choke points, allow signal fires to spread warnings across hundreds of miles. Look, intimidating in the morning fog. What it couldn't do: stop full-scale invasions. Defend every single mile with troops. Impossible. Even China didn't have that many spare soldiers. Guarantee loyalty from the generals in charge of the gates. Prevent bribery, because money speaks louder than walls. So yeah, the wall was like locking your door while also leaving a spare key under the mat. Helpful, but not exactly foolproof. The watchtower life. Okay, now picture this. You're a Ming soldier stationed in some watchtower in Inner Mongolia, hundreds of miles from home. The wall stretches out in both directions, endless stone cutting across the hills. You have 3 main jobs: look for smoke, light your own smoke, and not die of boredom. Guard duty meant long, silent nights staring into the distance. If you saw movement, raiders, merchants, or maybe just a herd of goats, you lit a fire. The next tower lit their fire, and so on. A medieval relay race of flames. Messages could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, which was honestly pretty efficient for the 15th century. But living in those towers wasn't glamorous. Supplies were irregular, winters were brutal, and when raiders actually attacked, most garrisons were too small to stop them outright. Imagine waiting weeks for backup that may or may not arrive, while wondering why you didn't just become a farmer like your cousin. Regional wall styles. Not all stones are equal. Now here's something people don't usually realize. The Great Wall isn't one uniform construction. Depending on where you are, it looks totally different. In the east, near Beijing, stone and brick walls, the kind you see in glossy travel photos. Solid, square, and dramatic against the mountains. In the desert west, tamped earth walls. Basically giant clay barriers, once tall and thick, now weathered into dusty ridges. They look less like fortresses and more like the ruins of a forgotten sandcastle. In Gansu province, parts reinforced with reeds and gravel, layered like a cake. Ingenious at the time, but centuries of wind erosion haven't been kind. In remote frontier regions, sometimes the wall was just trenches and wooden palisades. Because when you're hundreds of miles from stone quarries, you improvise. So really, the Great Wall was more like a family of walls. Some glamorous, some shabby, some barely holding it together, like the dynasties that built them. Philosophy of walls, civilization versus chaos. Now let's get a little abstract. Because the wall wasn't just stone, it was an idea. In Chinese political thought, there was this constant tension between the civilized agricultural south and the barbarian nomadic north. Walls reinforced that worldview. They created a visible line between us and them, the empire and the wilderness, order and chaos. Of course, reality was messier. There was trade across the border. There were nomads serving as imperial guards. There were Chinese princesses marrying steppe leaders. But emperors loved neat categories, and the wall gave them one. So, in a sense, the Great Wall was less about military and more about psychology. It wasn't just keeping people out, it was telling everyone where they belonged. Folklore, ghosts, and sad stories. Of course, a wall that long, built with that much suffering, attracts stories. And boy, does Chinese folklore deliver. We already met Meng Jiangnu, the woman whose tears brought down a section of the wall. But there are other tales too, like ghost stories of workers who died during construction and supposedly haunt the towers. Or songs about soldiers stuck on lonely patrols, yearning for home. Even poetry picked up the theme. Tang Dynasty poets wrote verses about the endless frontier, where winds howled against empty towers. The wall became a metaphor for distance, separation, and the futility of trying to keep the world divided. So when you walk the wall today, imagine not just soldiers and bricks, but echoes, songs, laments, whispers in the wind. If history has a dreamlike soundtrack, the Great Wall has one of the saddest playlists. Foreign views, the wall as exotic wonder. Let's step out of China for a second. How did foreigners see the Great Wall? Early travelers from Central Asia and the Middle East heard of it as a massive frontier fortification. When European Jesuits arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were awestruck. They sent back glowing reports to Europe. China has this giant wall stretching forever, guarding an empire so rich and mighty you wouldn't believe it. These stories helped fuel Europe's fascination with China as a land of mystery, wealth, and strange customs. The Great Wall was like the marketing campaign for an entire civilization. Even though most Europeans would never see it, the idea alone was enough to inspire legends. So yes, the Great Wall was ancient China's best PR move. Better than silk, better than porcelain, maybe even better than tea. The wall in decline, a patchwork of ruins. But after the Ming fell, the wall started crumbling, literally. Without constant upkeep, stone slips, bricks crack, earth erodes. Villagers treated it like a free Home Depot. Need bricks for your house? Just grab a few from the wall. Need stones for your pig pen? The wall has plenty. Nobody was guarding it anymore, so why not? By the 19th century, when Western travelers started poking around, parts of the Great Wall were already in ruins. Some wrote dramatic descriptions of collapsed towers and half-buried sections. The wall was less a defense system, more a romantic ruin for curious adventurers to sketch in their notebooks. 20th century revival, from ruin to symbol. Fast forward to the 20th century, China went through revolutions, wars, and political upheaval. For a while, the Great Wall wasn't exactly top priority. But in the mid-1900s, leaders began to see its potential, not as a military barrier, but as a national symbol. Mao Zedong famously said, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man." Which, okay, sounds a bit macho for a sightseeing slogan, but it worked. Suddenly, the wall was tied to patriotism, strength, and unity. Later, in the reform era of the 1980s, the government restored sections near Beijing for tourism. And that's the version most people know today. Wide stone steps, rebuilt towers, and hordes of tourists in matching hats, following guides with little flags. Meanwhile, the wilder, unrestored sections remain quiet, crumbling into hillsides, overtaken by grass, hidden from highways. Two walls exist side by side, the glossy Instagram wall and the forgotten ruin wall. Tourism and the wall's modern identity. Today, millions of visitors trudge up its steep slopes every year. They take selfies, buy overpriced water bottles, and marvel at the view. The Great Wall has become less about defense and more about cardio. And yet, it still inspires awe. Standing on a ridge, seeing the wall snake away into misty mountains, you can almost feel the centuries. You can almost hear those exhausted soldiers, the creak of carts carrying bricks, the sighs of emperors demanding more. The wall outlived its original purpose. It outlived dynasties. It even outlived the myths. And now it lives as memory, a giant stone dream that refuses to die. Drifting thoughts for the night. So as you drift deeper into rest, picture that ribbon of stones stretching into darkness. Each section built by different hands, for different reasons, yet still connected. A monument not just to defense, but to obsession. The emperors wanted control. The workers wanted survival. The poets wanted metaphors. And together, they built something both practical and useless, brutal and beautiful. That's the paradox of the Great Wall, a wall that failed at its job but succeeded in becoming immortal. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. Human projects don't always achieve their goals, but sometimes, by accident, they leave something lasting. Something future generations will wander, photograph, and tell stories about while trying to fall asleep. Hey again! If you're still with me, congratulations! You've now spent more time with the Great Wall than most Ming Dynasty soldiers ever wanted to. But don't worry, we're not done. Because once you start talking about walls, you realize humanity is kind of obsessed with them. So tonight, let's wander a little. Let's compare the Great Wall with other famous walls, bust the myths about seeing it from space, and end with what the wall means today. Humanity's weird love of walls. It's funny, for a species that invented fire, art, and dumplings, humans have also spent a shocking amount of time stacking rocks into lines. The Great Wall of China is the poster child, but it's far from the only one. There's Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Built by the Romans in the 2nd century CE, it marked the northern frontier of their empire. Basically, Rome's way of saying, this is Britain, that is Scotland, please don't mix. It wasn't nearly as long as the Great Wall, only about 73 miles. But in the British drizzle, it probably felt like eternity to the soldiers stationed there. Then there's the Berlin Wall, modern and infamous, separating East and West Germany during the Cold War. Not exactly built for Mongol raids, but still about dividing us from them. Unlike the Great Wall, though, the Berlin Wall was taken down in living memory. People chipped away at it with hammers, instead of letting centuries of erosion do the job. And if you go even further back, there were walls around Mesopotamian cities, Persian fortifications, even the walled city of Jericho in biblical times. Walls are universal. They say a lot about our need for security, or at least the appearance of security. So, the Great Wall isn't just a Chinese story. It's part of a global human hobby. The belief that if you build a big enough barrier, your problems will politely stay on the other side. Spoiler, they never do. The space myth, why we love it. All right, let's tackle that persistent myth, the idea that the Great Wall is the only man-made object visible from space. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like astronauts floating above the Earth, looking down, and the only thing they see is this giant gray line zigzagging across China, as if the emperors built it with NASA in mind. Reality check. You can't see it, at least not with the naked eye from low Earth orbit. Astronauts like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and later Chinese astronauts have all confirmed this. The wall is narrow, about 20 to 30 feet wide, and it blends into the landscape. It's basically the same color as the dirt around it. From space, you're more likely to see highways, airports, or giant cities lit up at night. Those stand out. The Great Wall, not so much. So where did the myth come from? Probably from 18th and 19th century Western writers who exaggerated everything about China to make it sound exotic. They thought, wow, this wall is so big, surely it's visible from the moon. And then the rumor just stuck. But even if it's false, the myth survives because it makes the wall feel even more epic. Humans love exaggerating. It's the longest wall. It's the only thing from space. It was built with the bones of workers. None of these are strictly true, but they make great dinner table trivia. The wall as a national symbol. Now let's float back down to Earth. In modern China, the Great Wall isn't just a ruin. It's a cultural icon. School children learn patriotic songs about it. Tourists pose for photos on restored sections like Badaling and Mutianyu. Leaders reference it in speeches, and in 2007, the wall was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world. Mao Zedong's line, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man," turned it into a rite of passage. Never mind the poor peasants, who were forced to climb it daily with baskets of bricks. Today, it's framed as a symbol of strength, resilience, and the spirit of the Chinese people. And fair enough, if you want a symbol of endurance, it's hard to beat a structure that's been hanging around for over 2 millennia, outlasting dynasties, invasions, and the occasional tourist carving their initials into the bricks. The glossy wall versus the forgotten wall. Of course, not all parts of the Great Wall are treated equally. The restored sections near Beijing are carefully maintained, polished, and marketed. They've got staircases, safety rails, snack stands, even cable cars for tourists who don't feel like climbing. This is the Instagram wall, the one you see in travel guides. But then there are the wild sections, crumbling earthworks in the desert, half-buried ridges in Gansu, lonely watchtowers tilting like drunken chess pieces. These places are rarely visited, sometimes dangerous and quietly haunting. They're the real wall, the wall that ordinary soldiers patrolled, the wall that peasants died building, the wall that emperors forgot about when the dynasty collapsed. And in a way, those ruined sections tell the truest story. Not the glossy tourist version, but the fragile, weathered reality. History always looks prettier after restoration, but if you want authenticity, you have to sit with the ruins. The wall in popular culture. The Great Wall has also had a weird afterlife in movies, books, and even video games. Sometimes it's shown as this magical barrier against monsters, like in the 2016 fantasy film The Great Wall, where Matt Damon, yes really, fights alien lizard creatures alongside Chinese warriors. Historical accuracy, 0. Visual spectacle, maximum. Other times, it's used as a symbol of mystery. Documentaries pan across its endless curves with dramatic music, treating it like a riddle. Video games set missions on it. Novelists describe it as a metaphor for isolation or endurance. Basically, the Great Wall has become a blank canvas. People project their own fears and fantasies onto it, which is kind of ironic, considering emperors originally built it to project their fears and fantasies. History really does recycle itself. The environmental footprint. Here's a quieter angle. Building the Great Wall didn't just consume human labor. It also shaped landscapes. Forests were cleared to provide timber. Quarries dug out hillsides for stone. Fields were diverted to feed garrisons. Even today, erosion patterns are different in places where the wall once stood. And those environmental changes outlived the dynasties that ordered them. The wall isn't just a monument in stone. It's etched into the very geography, a scar across the land, visible even where the bricks are gone. So when we talk about the wall, we're not just talking about history. We're talking about ecosystems altered by imperial ambition. Lessons from a wall that didn't work. Let's be honest, the Great Wall didn't succeed in its main mission. It didn't stop invasions. It didn't save dynasties. It couldn't prevent generals from defecting or peasants from rebelling. And yet, people still call it great. Why? Because sometimes the value of a monument isn't in what it achieved, but in what it represents. The wall represents human effort on a ridiculous scale. Determination, fear, ambition, and sheer stubbornness, all piled into stone. It's a reminder that people will go to incredible lengths, literally thousands of miles of them, to feel safe. Even if that safety is an illusion. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, think about that paradox. A wall that failed at war, but triumphed in memory. A project that consumed countless lives, but ended up symbolizing resilience. A monument that was both practical and pointless, brutal and beautiful. A Great Wall stretches across mountains and deserts, but also across centuries of imagination. It guarded emperors, burdened peasants, inspired poets, and confused astronauts. It's both real and mythical, solid and crumbling, forgotten and world-famous. And maybe that's why it's the perfect bedtime story. Long, winding, repetitive, filled with human drama, but never too exciting. The kind of tale that lulls you, stone by stone, into sleep. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture the wall not as a fortress, but as a dream. A dream built by millions, haunted by legends, carried across time. A wall that was never really about keeping others out, but about telling ourselves who we are.